that does bring us to our final session of the day, and I'm really looking forward to this with the level of engagement that we have. Firstly, a really big thank you to all our speakers from this afternoon who have given us really a lot of food for thought when it comes to understanding animal ethics and how ethics impacts animal welfare. Our final session of the day is a panel discussion where we want to explore the theme animal ethics, where to from here, for Australia and beyond. So I encourage you to keep those questions coming through the chat. If you would like us to target it to a specific speaker, then put the name in there for my benefit more than anyone else's so that I can keep track, because we have that many questions coming through. I will do my best to moderate with the amount of interest that we have. We'll welcome back our panel members for this afternoon. We have Professor Bindi Bennett from the Federation University, Dr. Clare Archer-Lean from the University of the Sunshine Coast, Associate Professor Jane Kotzmann from Deakin University. Peter has stayed with us, and Dr. Tim Dean, hopefully he's about to jump on, yes, from the Ethics Centre. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this wrap-up session for the end of the day. I do have an opening question for everyone to get us started. And Tim, I'm going to throw to you first. For your very quick elevator pitch in less than 2 minutes, where would you like to see animal ethics head in the future?
Good question. Hi, everybody. Look, I think my answer to that is really to focus on the ethics part of it. Where would I like to see animal ethics go is I would like to see it engage in greater ethical discourse. So what that means is we drew a distinction at the Ethics Centre between like the non-moral world where, we're thinking about how do we achieve our goals or whatever that might be. We think about the moral, which is the way that we've been brought up to see values and things that we think are important. Our intuitive ideas of right and wrong. It's enculturated, and there are as many moral views as there are families, cultures, religions, and different kinds of upbringings. We talk about ethics as being the way that we reflect upon particularly moral questions, bring them to the surface, and then provide good reasons to support the decisions that we make. So I think moving more into that ethical frame where we are able to acknowledge the diversity of moral worldviews when it comes to our relationships to animals, but then bring that conversation up so that we lay everything on the table and we draw upon good reasons to support our views. And I really like Peter's point that he made earlier about who's easier to reach. Is it the anthropocentric or is it the disengaged? See, at least the anthropocentric have already started thinking morally. They've already started thinking about finding reasons to support their particular views. They're easier to then bring into this ethical conversation. The trick is going to be to get the disengaged to start thinking morally and then bring them into the ethical conversation. If we could just do that in the future, I think that would be a triumph, and that would help advance all of our causes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tim. Given us a bit of homework to do there, I think. Bindi and or Claire, do you have a 2-minute elevator that you can perhaps share with us about the future of animal ethics?
I think we can both answer this question in perhaps 2 parts. First of all, I haven't met the rest of you and have very much enjoyed your talks today. So hello, and I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Kabi Kabi country, and I acknowledge this country has never been ceded. I think for our perspective here, it's really important to acknowledge that the systems that currently exist in terms of suggesting ethical frameworks are still deeply implicated in a colonial thinking, and that we have to understand that we are animals, and that ethics needs to shift beyond an understanding of human or animal, and an understanding that actually we're situated within a situation that is colonial and anthropocentric. The two are utterly linked, and that until we start to take anti-colonial approaches to ethical frameworks and think about animal welfare as including everybody, then we are going to have a really deep misreading of the intra-penetration of human-animal societies and the deep connections between the challenges and opportunities that face us, and that we're we are really going to have to jettison some of our fantasies of control that exist in the current status, and fantasies that the current status is right. So we're probably coming from a more radical position and push for something quite distinct, which perhaps Bindi can develop.
Great. Over to you, Bindi.
I'll be really quick. I want to develop an Indigenous and incorporated anti-colonial informed ethics. And from that, I want them to be relational, I want them to be respectful, and I want them to be reciprocal. And I think these are very big things that some non-Indigenous people don't really understand, reciprocal relationships. I want us to move from terms of dominance over and superiority of knowledge and skills and expertise and all these words, and actually become much more integrated and woven into Aboriginal ways of knowing, doing and being, and from there create something that is not separable from our environmental, country, land, sky, water health to our animal/human health. That'd be my goal.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, would you like to answer next?
Yeah, please. I thought Jane was first, but that's okay. I would like to get animal ethics a bit out of the boxes. It probably links to what Tim said about morality and ethics, that we tend to sort of, oh, these are dogs, these are pigs, these are wild animals, and then we have these very, very separate discussions, and some animal welfare organizations, unfortunately, also tend to foster that sort of compartmentalization. And I would really love to see a larger debate about animals and recognize an animal as an animal as an animal, and have that debate and thereby actually sort of moderating some of the discussions and also making progress on some of the really difficult ones. I think the difficult ones are still the farm animals, because we are up against some enormous economic forces, whereas I think we see a lot of progress in when it comes to companion animals. We also seen recently a lot of interesting focus and developments in wild animals, but getting a discussion where an animal is an animal would make a lot of progress.
Excellent, thank you. And Jane, over to you.
Thanks again. Yeah, I agree with a lot of the points raised by the other presenters. We absolutely need to understand that as humans, we are animals. We're more closely related to some other species than some other animal groups entirely. So we're definitely not out of that framework, and we need to understand that when we talk about ethics and how we treat animals. We also need to understand that the health outcomes of humans, animals, and the environment are all strongly interconnected. And so when we make decisions about how we treat animals, we need to keep that in mind, that, and this is obviously a very anthropocentric view, but it's going to impact us. So at the end of the day, even people who don't care about animals should still care. I mentioned in my Q&A that I'm very much pro-animal rights, so I would like to see ethics move in a direction of animals as rights holders versus animals as things to which we should do things in relation to. But my, I guess, more concrete suggestions are from the perspective of the welfare framework, given that that's probably going to be around for a while. And from the perspective, the legal perspective, in terms of, I'm obviously a lawyer, so I think in terms of what do we need to do in relation to the law. There are things that I would like the legislature, the executive and the courts to do. The legislature need to tighten up animal welfare legislation. We need to make sure that all animals are actually covered by legislation. So we're not excluding what is in reality most of the animals that exist from protection. We need to make sure standards aren't watered down just purely because of commercial interests. And we need to make sure that use of animals is completely transparent and accountable. At the moment, law actually kind of goes the other way, particularly in relation to farmed animals. In relation to the executive, we need to ensure that enforcement of animal welfare provisions is enforced. And to do that, it's adequately funded. So whether it's RSPCA or whether it's government department, or whether it's somebody else entirely, we need funding to ensure enforcement. And we need to ensure that the policies that we have in place, someone referenced in the chat, codes of practice, we need to make sure that these are not just industry documents, but that they reflect more broad interests and really animal interests. And finally, with the judiciary, we see from the research that sentencing in relation to animal offences is very lenient, very inconsistent in terms of both the outcomes and factors that are taken into account by courts. So we need more development from the judiciary in terms of how they go about sentencing animal cruelty offenders.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Some really practical ideas for moving forward. Okay, so now we're going to throw to some of our attendee questions, and there's quite a few of them coming through. Tim, I might throw to you first. And April's question, do you think ethics is just rationalising a particular viewpoint?
It's a great question, April, and certainly historically and empirically, yes, for a lot of people it is. They just use ethics, they weaponize ethics to provide justifications. In my talk, I mentioned the idea of using post hoc rationalizations to, like, we've got an internal lawyer who's going to come up with good reasons to defend our particular views. But that is using ethics poorly. Ethics done right is really scrutinizing our reasons, is really challenging and being critical of our reasons. It's being self-reflective. It's not trusting our intuitions. It's bringing them to the surface and really putting pressure on them by applying ethical principles to them. So certainly, like, I used to teach critical thinking, which is a similar kind of idea of you finding arguments to support views. And I noticed a lot of my students were weaponizing it to kind of throw fallacies at people and all that kind of stuff. You can use these tools for good or for ill. Ethics done right forces us to really face up to the scrutiny of reason and not use that appearance of reason to justify our pre-existing views.
Right. Thank you. Jane? Oh, sorry, Peter, yes?
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, there's a certain style of philosophy which I guess Tim and I would agree that's a bit childish. Yeah, I'm right. I'm a utilitarian. I hear all my utilitarian arguments. I mean, I love, actually, I mean, that's why I've changed. I used to be like that when I was young, but I'm much more being pluralist. When I teach my students, I don't think, I'm not there to tell you what's right and wrong. I have my views, of course, but what I want you to do is to reflect, think sincerely. And those who learn most of it from me are those who disagree with me, but engage in a serious discussion with me. So I'm a great fan of actually allowing arguments to be heard and not having this sort of, oh, I'm right, and since you're not a rights person, you're wrong. I think that's a dreadful way of arguing, and it's actually been sort of customary among some of the leading figures in animal ethics for quite a while.
Excellent. Thank you. Jane, I'm going to ask you a question on Australia's so-called ag-gag laws, and do you think they're blocking and preventing transparency, and does this encourage more disengagement?
I guess in short, yes, I agree. I think those ag-gag laws do prevent transparency. So they are in place in a number of jurisdictions and essentially prevent activists from going on to farms and taking photo or video footage and then providing that either directly to the public or to organisations that will publish it. We've had a lot of legal change come about as a result of those kinds of actions, which has been really positive legal change. The concern from the farmer's perspective, of course, is that often farmers live on these properties and they want their privacy to be respected, and they'll suffer commercial losses, obviously, if they're shown in public to be in a negative light. There is very much a halfway house. It doesn't have to be, yes, we can all traipse onto farms and have a look. We can, and what has been done in a number of European jurisdictions is install CCTV to record what's actually happening in those farms, so that, you know, then whoever's appropriate can review that footage and ensure that appropriate standards are being upheld, which is what I'd advocate for. But that's being resisted in Australia so far.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, interesting. Bindi and Claire, I think this is a really great question to throw to you. How do you think we can approach discussions about animal welfare in a way that is culturally sensitive? Have you got some practical examples? Many of the people who are signed on today might work for, whether it's the RSPCA or other animal welfare organisations. What practical pointers would you give us to start approaching these discussions in a way that is sensitive?
I think one of the conversations is you have to know what your own culture is before you can be sensitive at all. So knowing who you are, what your biases are, what your worldview is, what your cultural framework is a really good start with that conversation. And then I think you need to come across what is your bias and positioning with the whole word of animal welfare. Whose animal are we talking about? So I think that's a good start to chewing that one. I think anything that we come to with respect, true respect, is going to go well.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting and important aspect to consider. Did you have anything to add, Claire?
Sorry, I'm clicking too much. Just, I suppose, to think about just developing what Bindi's saying is to think about how often in ethics we talk about, we use particular pronouns, we, and they, and the assumptions that are happening there. So yeah, there's always a sense of who is needing to go into a space and who is actually receiving, or that's at the baseline there. And we saw that in our discussion too, that is happening. So I really think it's about that, exactly that, bringing in your speaking position and understanding that the reciprocity and the two-way sharing of knowledge as a really starting point, but also, yeah, using a kind of common sense approach and a shared humanity.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you. Peter, yes. See your hand up.
I just want to add, I fully sympathize with that. I also think it's very important to start at home. I used to do a lot of work with laboratory animals, not myself, but talking to people. And originally there was a culture that said, we do this. And then people realized that there were people there who was not part of that we. So acknowledging that even close to home, there are different views, and respecting the articulation of those views, and not saying, oh, you can't be here if you're not fully in favor of. I mean, you can work with animal experimentation, but still be much more critical than the mainstream, and allowing that discussion, I think, is a really important part of allowing the reflection that this collective we is just ridiculous. I think there should be a law against using the collective we. That's the thing I hate most, when people say, we do this and that. No, some people do this, some others do that. And stop that talking in this way about this we, because that's really dreadful.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it speaks to that respect and understanding where you're coming from as an individual rather than making assumptions about others. So thank you, Peter. So Grover has a question. Oh, sorry, it's just moved on my screen, which is interesting. Animal welfare can be hard to get animal rights people to engage with, and we both want the best and the better for animals, but often evidence and attempts for incremental process is rejected. Moral outrage and extreme or black and white thinking or absolutism seems to get in the way of what could be a cooperative push for good. Do you have any advice on broaching the gap between two animal-focused ethical approaches? And Tim, I might throw to you first for that one.
Yeah, look, that's a really, really good question. So one distinction that I've mentioned already today, I'll mention it again briefly, is there are, particularly from Western thinking and intuitively in Western thinking, there are two kinds of schools of ethical thinking. There's the consequentialist thinking. We think about outcomes. The right thing to do is the thing that makes the world better, depending on how we think we define better. And then there's the rights-based, or the deontological, or the kind of duty-based, which is about the principles that we uphold, that we will not violate, the rules that we want to maintain. And these two views are, well, people tend to lean one way or another. We often kind of fall into both camps, but people tend to lean one way more than the other. And these two views often come into conflict. They come into conflict with things outside of this context, something like drug testing. We know that drug testing reduces overdoses, introduces people to support services they need to get off drugs, has a good outcome. Consequentialists think it's a great idea. Duty rights deontologists say, well, the rule is you don't take dangerous drugs. You don't encourage people to take illegal drugs. Even if we know that the drug testing is going to, or the injecting rooms are going to help them, we're still violating a principle. Now, we see the same tension here between a welfare approach, which talks about what are the outcomes that we care about, and a rights approach, which say what are the kind of inviolable principles that we can never, override. Rights-based approaches have a strength in their black and white thinking, in their convictions of like a clarity of what we do and do not allow. The weakness is an inflexibility and sometimes a kind of a perfectionism. The welfare approach has a benefit in being able to be incremental, saying a small improvement is still an improvement, so that's what we should go past. My point here is just to bring to surface these two different approaches that are intuitively appealing to different kinds of thinkers, and encourage a discussion that bridges the gap between the two, finds language to allow you to talk in the rights-based or the welfare-based language, for you to be able to reframe things using your language in a way that people from the other side may understand a little bit better. I'm not going to give the answers on how to do that. I'm still working on that, right? If we have the simple answer, please let me know. We'll publish a paper. But what I'm saying is that there are these two different frameworks. People think and engage differently. Finding a way to then connect those two frameworks is going to at least enable a fruitful conversation.
And Peter, yes.
Yeah, I think also there's an interesting division of labor here. Many, many years ago, I was chairman of the government's advisory committee on farm animals, and we produced a rather critical report on broiler chicken. And the industry was there, and we were really afraid they would shut it down. But then luckily there was a guy, an animal rights person, say, oh, what you say, Peter, is just, patchwork, doesn't solve anything. He brought a frozen broiler, and suddenly the industry was all on my side on the progress. So that was a big help to the welfare. That there was an animal rights person in the room that scared them to hell, saying, oh, we better side with Peter Sandøe on the progress, because otherwise some of these nasty guys will take over. So I think there's an interesting division of labor, and we need both discourses. And I think what we need is, some sort of, at the end of the day, some sense of humor and respect for that we each have our role in this debate. And I guess also you Jane, you would know that in animal protection, there's also a role for animal rights persons, and there's a role for the more pragmatic, and they both play a role in making the world move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think that might give an interesting sort of segue. Sorry, I've lost it again. Sorry, the chat keeps moving on me. But I'm going to open this up to anyone, because I don't think we've discussed anything along these lines today. Kathy's asked to hear people's opinion on greyhound racing in Australia. It talks about a current bill, but I don't believe there is one, that, not at least to my knowledge, in Australia, and it is regulated by states and territories, greyhound racing, so it would have to be a bill at that level. But we are aware that New Zealand has recently banned greyhound racing. And of course, the ethics of this is quite interesting, from using animals for entertainment, and also, I guess, there's the gambling and betting aspect of this conversation as well, and the fact that greyhound racing is financially supported by governments in most states and territories to continue. So does anyone have a particular desire to answer this question? Yeah, Jane.
Yeah, just briefly in terms of the bill itself. Actually, I wasn't aware of this bill, but I've done a little bit of background Googling, and is it Kathy? Yeah, Kathy's right. There was a bill introduced on the 12th of February into the New South Wales Parliament, the Greyhound Racing Ban Bill of 2025. I imagine it was probably inspired somewhat by the recent New Zealand decision to try and ban greyhound racing there. As we know, this is a take two for New South Wales. Am I in favour? Absolutely. I think we should ban greyhound racing, but I guess we need to be really wary, because what happened in New South Wales previously was we banned it, and then, it didn't go so well, and we had a backflip. So we want to prevent that kind of thing by having proper consultation and discussion so that we don't end up with the same situation.
Yeah, thank you. I think that comes to Tim's comment earlier about being able to have the difficult conversations and back up our perspectives with the evidence and the reasoning for why we may have a particular perspective on things like greyhound racing. So does anyone else have a comment on that one before I move on?
I think greyhound racing is in a sort of global perspective around marginal, much bigger issue is horse racing. As you might know, there's a huge international debate right now about using horses in sports, and I think that's where I think greyhound. My view is greyhound racing is probably going to die out by itself. It's not exciting enough, but I think the horse is the area where we will have a big debate, and that's. And there are two groups there, those who think that we need a ban and those who think we need to reform. And I must say, whenever I see these competitions, it seems that the worst guys actually always win. So reform doesn't seem really to work. But it's a really interesting discussion is whether you can reform things like dressage to a way where the training methods become humane. So I think that's the other big issue related to the question is I think in the horses is a much bigger issue than the greyhounds.
Thank you. Interesting future ahead for both, I think, greyhound and horse racing. Tim, if I can throw to you, can you please speak a little bit more about the necessity to call out significant cruelty, harm or suffering? These situations often require immediate action where there is often a power imbalance or power over where engagement and asking questions will be futile and or prolonged suffering.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Look, this is an issue. And this is a question I get asked a lot because I'm a big proponent for engagement and slow change, which I think is the easiest route to change. But what that raises, and a weakness of my view that I fully acknowledge, is that sometimes we need to move quickly. Sometimes we need to call things out. And there's a limit to the power of engagement when, for example, there are serious power imbalances, and power is an enormous factor. It's something I haven't really talked about. But at the Ethics Centre, while we love to talk about ethics, we really do acknowledge that even if we have all the right ethical answers, we also need the power to make sure that people understand and are willing to abide by the right ethical answers. So my only advice is that we need to be steadfast with our values and with our principles. We need to call out things when we see things that are wrongdoing. But we need to draw a distinction between calling things out to satisfy our sense of outrage when doing so may undermine our cause, compared to calling things out in a way that we think can scaffold future constructive change. And it is really difficult sometimes when we see suffering and we see wrongdoing, and we have no ability to call that out in a way that is not going to inflame the situation. And that's a kind of a moral injury that we inflict upon ourselves by not standing steadfast with our values. But my personal view is that because I am kind of a consequentialist, we look for the best route to future positive change. And so we call things out in a way that can enact that change and not do it in a way that's going to trigger greater defensiveness that will ultimately undermine our cause. And that can be painful and uncomfortable. But from my perspective, I don't see an alternative, but I can totally see how other people would not agree with me on that point.
There is a lot of literature around race and racism about calling people in instead of calling people out. So instead of shaming and making people feel often guilty and distressed, we can actually bring them into a more reciprocal, respectful conversation. So Racism Stops With Me is a great website to come and start to learn how to call people in, and they have actual strategies of how to do that, because I think that people need to build up their resiliency before you go, and their capacity, and be emotionally regulated, sorry, social worker, but all those things before you have those conversations. And there's also, you have to think about age and stage. There's no point asking great grandpa to change their views at Christmas time. It's going to hurt you and it's going to hurt them. So there's got to be some consent and some conversation about capacity before we go into these very robust conversations. And what resiliency plan do you have when you get distressed or upset, or you're very much different to the other person? How's that going to be managed well? So I think there's several layers to this. I see social workers do it a lot because, we change the world. They decide to call out everybody at every occasion, and it just hurts everyone. We have to actually do it very thoughtfully and, can I say, ethically.
Yeah, really, really interesting perspective there, Bindi. Thank you for sharing that. I might throw to you, Bindi and Claire, for the next question as well. What are some of the practical examples of how we can shift from a moralizing approach to a moral approach?
Well, I think it's all about language, isn't it? And this is all the colonizing conversation of, neoliberalist conversation and capitalist conversation. We really have to tear apart all these things and come to the table with a position. What is our positioning? What is our ethical stance? What is our true north? What's our purpose here? Who will this benefit? How will this benefit? Doesn't matter what word we put to it. There's no good word, but there is good values behind it. There are good ethics behind it. There is a good way to do and be. So I think that's the conversation that we need to have, is how do we all come to the table and have principles, guiding principles of how we're going to go about some of this well, if that makes sense. So I think I've sort of talked a little bit about that in terms of before. Claire, did you want to add anything with that?
Just that moralizing has to be understood as an exercise of power. It's a verb, and it's an attempt to exert power upon somebody else, which is intrinsically immoral. So the paradox within that can be pointed out. And then if you have those shared external values, then I think that's how I would see it. That's what a moral position is.
Wow, I feel like some of these conversations and each question alone needs half an hour. I'd love to do some deeper dives into some of these things, so apologies that we can't do that. I want to ask Karen's question next, and I think it's interesting because I have seen and we've noticed some debate in the chat around animal welfare type programs like Red Tractor. And Karen's question is there a need for more animal welfare programs for farmers to engage in so that they can be independently audited against agreed standards, so that we can look to improving and demonstrating good welfare, or perhaps higher welfare? There's lots of different words you could use there rather than good welfare. Recognising that the RSPCA only covers a limited species at the moment, mostly pigs and chickens, but layer hens, meat chickens, a couple of other species. But interested, perhaps I'll throw to you first, Peter, because you did reference some of these programs in your talk, and see if anyone wants to comment as well.
As I said, I think these sort of labels have the weakness that they in a way make things more costly, but they have the advantage that show there's a difference. And that's what very important part of progress. When I grew up, you could only buy one kind of animal product, so there was no idea that you could do things better. So having alternative products out there, it's really important that they're being well done. You may have heard about the scandal in the UK where the Freedom Food things have turned out not living up to standards. So you have to be very transparent, do it well, and make sure that they're being well audited. But I think in Europe we've had great. I mean, we have this system, the three-tiered system. We have the basic product following European legislation. Then we have the sort of indoor improved, and then outdoor organic, and it's actually stabilized a lot. And some products like the eggs now, even though the cages, the enriched cages, are still out, they're not more or less sort of getting extinct in some countries. So they do play a role. So it's important to have these things, but also be careful not to get too many, because that just causes confusion. And make sure that over time the idea is not to keep on having this extra cost. So I think, as I said, corporate social responsibility, get some shops actually to buy into a concept, may be a better way forward.
Interesting. Jane,
Can I just add that, I'll just add that the way that we're actually doing some of these practices in Australia is very Western. And so then when we decide on a good or better practice, we're actually creating more Western onto a land that is not Western. So we actually cause our land country more problems. So I think unless we have Indigenous people at the table to discuss what land care principles there are, we're going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And we already know that Australia doesn't take well to 80,000 years of knowledge of how to do things well, like that we have actually got Indigenous wheat, and we actually do have Indigenous animals that we could decide to utilise should we need to or want to. Not saying it's the right thing to do, just saying we do. So I think we have to just be aware that we have Western animals with Western systems, and now we're going to have Western policies, and that's all going to make Western problems.
Thank you very much for that perspective. Jane?
Yeah, I guess I'd just add that.
Hang on. Sorry, Jane. Can you maybe mute and come back again? We've just got a bit of a ringing, which has been there, but it's just come back stronger, so we'll try again.
Let's try that. Is that any better?
No, unfortunately.
No.
Talk for a little bit. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. I just add that I think it's really important to consider who's coming up with these certification regimes, because, for example, in relation to the RSPCA, I would say the RSPCA shouldn't be providing this kind of regime, because I think fundamentally there's a conflict of interest there. There's a suggestion that the RSPCA approves of these products that perhaps, are not necessarily. I think the RSPCA's role is to hold government to account, and other non-profits as well, in terms of what they have said that they will do. But perhaps there's space for other organisations without a conflict to come up with some certification regimes.
Interesting perspective. Thank you. It is one that has lots of different perspectives. So thank you very much. I was wanting to ask a wrap-up question, and unfortunately we've run out of time. I think we've done fairly well at covering a lot of questions from our audience. And as I said, I would love to sit here for another few hours and have flesh out some of these debates. And it's been a really great start to opening up some conversations. We do encourage everyone to please make sure that you look further into anything that's raised questions for you today and go for a bit more of a deep dive. There's lots of information on the RSPCA website, including about certification schemes and things like that. So we encourage our attendees to look into that if they're interested. Thank you very much to all our panelists for a very interesting and nuanced discussion. So thank you for joining us for an extra bit of time today, in particular for those who have a time difference, Peter in particular. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of day one of the seminar. Again, a huge thank you to all our speakers and to all the participants for your active engagement. I do believe it's been one of the most active presentations and seminars that we've had to date, and most engaged. So we really hope you found today's session very informative. Don't forget that all the presentations will be available via the resource hub as soon as possible after the seminar, and we will be adding the Q&A sessions as well. Please don't forget to provide feedback on the seminar this afternoon using the survey form that will appear after the demo session ends. There you go, it's popped up, magic colon in the background. Your feedback is much appreciated and will help us with future seminars. Finally, a thanks to the RSPCA team for helping us field the questions and comments in the chat, and particularly the amazing Colin Tucker, who has been the wizard behind the curtain, working very diligently to make sure that all the technical aspects run smoothly. I apologise for a couple of the glitches that were out of our control today, and we will do our best to run as smooth as possible tomorrow. I believe the level of engagement has showed that hopefully it hasn't impacted your seminar experience too significantly. We do hope to have you all here back tomorrow for even more interesting and engaging talks on day 2. We'll see you at 12 o'clock Canberra time tomorrow. Thank you again, and that's us signing off. Thank you.